Welcome to Cold Case MHS, Monsters and Demons, where real education meets real life. I'm your host, Randy Hubbard.
And I'm your co-host, Lydia Lisko, and we thank you for listening.
Photographs faded, memories grown old, a story entangled, a crime so unfaithful, yet left untold. A puzzle in the dark, we will find that spark, there you've left their mark. Victims in memory, let's find the enemy, we won't leave it be. Behind every shadow, a story to be told, of lives that were special, but some hearts have grown cold. In the depths of the darkness, a flicker of hope remains. Behind every cold case, there's people fighting day to day.
So welcome back, and this year's kind of unusual in the fact that we had 3 groups pick fire cases. Now what's unusual about fire cases is that most people don't really know much about them, because when you think of cold cases, you think of shootings, stabbings, strangulation, things like that. Not many people really think too much about fire being used as a weapon. And for this year, it was really strange that we had 3 groups really pick that up. And I'm going to let these students introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their case.
Hi, I'm Emilio.
And I'm Ryan.
So, right off the bat, unfortunately, this arson had 3 different victims. A woman by the name of Deanna Perry, her grandson, Charles Climer Jr., and a child, which was at the time living on the streets, but they brought her and her mother in. This was Brianna Smith and her mother, Kristen Smith. However, Brianna Smith was the one who had died in the fire.
So, start off by giving us just a little overview of the case. What happened the night of the fire?
Yeah, so on October 15th, 2010, at around 5 a.m., Deanna Perry, Charles Climer, and Brianna Smith were all sleeping in the home when a fire erupted at their house. It started on the front porch. It was clear to police as soon as they arrived that it was arson. The fire started so quickly that when the firefighters got there, it was already too late. They all died of smoke inhalation. However, Charles was found outside the home. It was stated that he had tried to attempt to save Deanna and Brianna before he inevitably had to jump out the window.
So one thing that we noticed, as Ryan had mentioned, how it was clear to the police investigators that this was in fact an arson, was that they noted that gasoline had been poured around the entire proximity of the house, and there had been Molotov cocktails that were thrown upon the front porch.
So this seems like a very obvious, premeditated crime. Has Brianna, did she have anything going on around her? Did Deanna anything? Or Charles Climer, does anyone want to take this sort of harsh action against any of them?
So Deanna was known as someone who would take people in who needed like a place to stay, a warm meal, any like support, such as Kristen Smith and Brianna Smith, who needed some type of support to stay off the streets. It was suspected by the family members and the police at the time that Brianna Smith had been the main target to try to get back at Kristen Smith. We're not too sure as to like the exact motive of why someone would try to get back at Kristen Smith by killing Brianna, but that is the main theory that we were given by family members and what they had said that the police also thought.
While it has not yet been proven, there was some suspicion around the boyfriend of Kristen Smith, the mother of Brianna Smith. At the time, there were some internal tensions in the house, so Kristen Smith decided to leave the home, and Brianna ended up staying so that she could stay off the streets. However, Kristen's boyfriend, although it has not yet been proven, it was suspected that Kristen's boyfriend had gotten himself and a few other people to help them set the fire as a way to get back at Kristen.
Well, the unusual thing about that, though, is that you said the boyfriend was with Kristen at the time that the fire started. What are your thoughts on why he would be with her if he's trying to get rid of her?
So Kristen Smith was a drug addict. That was stated by Rebecca Climer and other people, people who wrote the articles, the reporters who wrote the articles. All the information we found about Kristen Smith led us to believe that she was a drug addict. So if she was a drug addict, she may have been, she didn't feel like she was in control of her own life, and she felt that she had to stay with somebody like her boyfriend at the time, even though they might not have had the best relationship. If it was some sort of abusive relationship, she might have been not in control of her own life, so she would have to stay with him.
Kristen Smith had stayed at the home previously with Deanna, but because, as we mentioned, those internal tensions, she ended up leaving. One thing that they noted was that Kristen Smith, the night of the fire, she had stayed over at her boyfriend's house, which, according to many other people, was pretty unusual of her, especially because the tension between their relationship.
So often in cold cases, we talk about victimology, which is the circumstances surrounding the victims. We talk about high risk versus low risk. So high risk victims are usually people who put themselves into more dangerous situations, such as drug addicts, prostitutes, things like that. Do you think Deanna made herself more of a risk as a victim because she was so welcoming to all and letting people like Kristen Smith into her life?
So yeah, that's interesting because that's one of the things that we noted in our presentation, that if Deanna was bringing in high-risk people such as Kristen Smith, then she may have brought in somebody else who could have also potentially been some sort of target that may have also been staying at her home. That was not mentioned by articles or family members or anyone like that because of the relevancy of Kristen Smith and Brianna Smith and when they were staying at the home. It may not have been as suspicion of other people staying in her home beforehand, who also may have been high-risk lifestyles, that also could have been targeted. So it is interesting. Deanna herself was not a high-risk lifestyle person, but she may have also brought in other people who have high-risk lifestyles.
Do you know if there were any previous incidents in the house regarding break-ins, any of that kind of stuff, potentially with other people that she brought in, or was this just a one-off situation?
We don't know of many other people that Deanna brought in. It was a wide range. So, as with Kristen and Brianna, she'd bring in people from the streets, but she would also oftentimes let family in. It was a very open door scenario. She was very open to anyone who needed a roof over their head. However, based on all of the articles that we had managed to find and discussions with the family, it seemed that there weren't many other people that were discussed.
Deanna didn't get rid of her, but there were some tensions between her and Kristen, correct? Mm-hmm. Do we have any idea what those frictions were? What was the argument? Did she just throw her out? Did Kristen leave on her own? Do we know?
We don't know exactly for sure the circumstances behind the tensions. It was mentioned in a couple articles that they had internal tensions, and some of our phone calls that they had internal tensions, but they never specifically stated exactly what kind of tensions. So we are not exactly too sure about what exactly strained their relationship. But we know that Kristen probably left on her own accord.
So you guys mentioned a lot about the articles. Let's talk a bit about your information finding process. Was it easy for you? Were you able to get in contact with a lot of people? So tell me a little bit about that.
So, especially with this case, it was particularly difficult to find a lot of information regarding this crime, because at the beginning we initially thought that we had found many articles. We had somewhere around 10 or 12 just off the first few weeks. However, one thing that we noticed was that these articles seemed to have been recycled from each other. There was an initial journalist, we found Theodore Decker, who had first written the article, and he was the most useful to us. We managed to get in communications with him. However, many of the other articles were written a few months, a year, several years after the original article, and they seemed to be some either Crime Stopper organizations or just people trying to get the story back out by taking and recycling the previous articles to make sure that information stays afloat.
What about from the police? Did you guys get anything, or even from the fire department that may have been involved? Anything like that?
We didn't get into contact specifically with any fire departments or anything, even though we did try to email the fire marshal and a retired fire chief that may have also worked on the case and other detectives that may have worked on the case. However, we did get a FOIA request with the autopsy report that gave us information about their carboxyhemoglobin levels, which confirmed that Charles had been found outside with much, much lower carboxyhemoglobin levels than Deanna and Brianna. But we did not get into any specific contact with fire stations, fire marshals, retired fire chiefs, or any detectives or anything. We are still in the process of trying to do that. They have not gotten back to us. But we did get a FOIA request.
Would you mind explaining what a FOIA request is?
Yeah, so it's a Freedom of Information Act that you can submit a request to get any sort of documents on any open case, such as autopsy reports and stuff like that. So we got all three from Franklin County Coroner's Office. Yeah, so we got all of their autopsy reports, which just confirmed that they all died of smoke inhalation.
Now, I think one thing to mention is that after we had gotten that influx of information from the articles and we submitted those FOIA requests, as Ryan had mentioned, after we started trying to talk to maybe some police departments, we contacted the arson department. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get a lot of information in there, and for a few months at least, we kind of had an information drought where we kind of had to work with only a few articles that had the original information. So it became relatively difficult to try to find and pull out new information. We were really only able to get out of that info drought after we were looking back through the articles that we already had, and we found one that we originally set off as plagiarism. We noted that it was the exact same as one of the very first articles that we found. It was a Facebook post. But when we looked into the comment section of that Facebook post, that's when we finally managed to find the family, and we were able to get more information from them.
So what kind of information did you get from the family?
So when we decided to talk to the family, we wanted to focus more about their account on who they were as people and try to find out what kind of people the victim were, so we could narrow down what kind of people would do this to someone like them. So we focused on trying to get more information in family accounts from what they think may have happened, what they thought of maybe who may have done it, maybe some type of just more information on the family, on the victims in general.
When you did the dive into the family and talk to them, that's a great source of information about who they were. But what is the problem with only getting information from the family?
If we only got information from the family, there's obviously bias account to it. The information that we got from them was very, very valuable. Most of the facts about the case that they gave to us checked out with the articles. So we wanted to learn more about the family, so their account, obviously, of Deanna and Charles and Brianna are probably the most valuable because they're the ones who spent the most time with them. But when it comes to who may have done it and something like that, there's obviously just a tad bit of bias there.
Right.
And unfortunately, when we contact the family, there's still a few things that we would be unable to clear up. For example, one of the articles had mentioned how the police department released a statement saying how they had decided to steer away from investigating the boyfriend who we were mentioning earlier, who seemed very suspicious. And since we were unable to contact any of the departments, we weren't able to really find out why, whether there was something that, he had his own alibi, or whether or not they were looking into another person who seemed suspicious, who we were just unaware of. So there was still that information kind of unable to be found.
So would you be able to give us an idea of what happened the day before, if there's any tensions, maybe the week before the fire happened, and then what happened after the fire? How did the investigation proceed?
So in our phone call with Lucas Henderson, he had stated that this is complete hearsay. However, he did say that his nephew had heard Kristen Smith's boyfriend threaten Kristen Smith a couple days or the day of the fire, saying, "Watch where you and that baby lay its head tonight." Obviously, this statement isn't, backed by concrete evidence. It is just a statement that we had in a phone call. However, if this is true, then it is a very big part of the type of tensions that could have been there.
As for the fire, the day of the fire itself, it was a little hard to get that information because it was done, as we mentioned earlier, at like 5 a.m. It was extremely dark. Not a lot of people were even awake at the time to witness or see anyone do it. So as far as we know, at around 4:30 a.m., that was when Ray Perry, the husband of Deanna, and Charles Howard, the father of Charles Climer Jr., had both left for work. And then between then and 5 a.m. was obviously when the fire occurred at 5 a.m. Somewhere between then, people had to have come in and poured the gasoline and set it alight. So there's kind of that empty 30-minute space where someone may have come in to burn down the house.
Do we happen to know if the neighbors were ever interviewed or looked into as a background to possibly see if maybe that house was not the one that was supposed to be burned?
We didn't get much information regarding about how maybe it was the wrong house, but we do know from an account of the neighbor that they themselves they were asleep at the time of the fire and had only been woken up because the flames of the house were so great that they started actually burning away at the sides of the neighboring houses next to it.
Okay.
So at the time they were asleep as well.
Okay. So right now it does appear that their house was the target for some reason.
Yeah.
As far as we know.
Yeah. So in our other two fire cases, the fires were started inside the house. What is unusual about yours?
It was started outside the house on the front porch. There was no such like forced entry or anything like that. It was something that was like premeditated and done quickly to try and get rid of the house as quickly as possible.
And you had mentioned earlier, what did they do with the gasoline?
They poured it around the edges of the house. Now, one thing to note with that is that because it was poured in front of the doors and such, it was unlikely that this fire was used to scare someone away or something like that. Most likely this house fire was designed to kill them.
So as for after the investigation, what kind of evidence did the police gather, if you know of any, and why did the case eventually end up going cold?
So, as far as we know, again, this is mostly just based off the article since we were unable to contact the police. The majority of the evidence that was found was the glass remains from the Molotovs thrown at the front porch. Outside of that, we don't know much about any other outside evidence.
Since arson is such like a violent crime and there's not much like evidence that could be left behind to like narrow down some sort of suspect or suspects besides like the fashion in which the fire was lit. This fire was stated by Lucas Henderson to be ignited in such a way as like a dope house in Detroit would be ignited. So like that could be some sort of evidence to try and like narrow down potential suspects. And it was also stated that investigators told him that multiple people were most likely involved. 1 or 2 or 3 people were likely involved in the setting of this fire. So this was like a very premeditated attack. That most of the evidence here is like how the fire was set. There's no like physical evidence to try and like narrow down some sort of like suspect. However, every other piece of evidence to try and like find out the person who did this was mostly like statements and interviews, which nothing really came out of those things.
Well, and unfortunately, fire does destroy a lot of that evidence. At this point, what do you think it's going to take to turn this case around or to get them to reopen it?
I think at this point, it mostly would have to take somebody who may know somebody who may have been involved in the case that had like a change of heart or something like that, who may like know information about what happened that night. Now, since the house is now a community garden, there's no crime scene to look off of, no evidence to look at now. The police still have the documents of everything that happened that night, and we haven't gotten in contact with them. But it would pretty much take like an anonymous tip or something like that to try and figure out what may have happened that night.
And if anyone does have that information, who should they contact? Where should they go?
So for those with information regarding the case, they can call the Columbus Division of Police Headquarters. That would be at 614-645-4760. With anyone information regarding the case, they can also deliver anonymous tips at Crime Stoppers at 614-645-4749.
And then I just have 2 more questions for you guys. Is there anything else that you want to mention about the case that we haven't already previously talked about? And then what lessons are you going to take from your experience investigating this crime? What are the lessons you're going to take, and how are you going to carry those after you graduate?
So at first we just want to highlight that this case was unusual because Deanna, Charles, and Brianna were all loving members of the community, obviously. Deanna had been stated by multiple people. Everyone that we talked to her was only painting her in a positive light, saying nice things about her, saying that she loved everybody and everybody loved her. Everyone called her mama, stuff like that around the neighborhood. So it was very unusual that someone with such a caring heart would be killed in such a fashion as this.
So just tell us a little bit about what you learned along the way, what your expectations were when you first got into the class, and what you're going to take with you as you leave.
I think one of the biggest things here was communication, because in and of itself, and no matter what field, whatever you do, communication is always important. And I feel that this class kind of takes the idea of communication and kind of really puts it on pressure. I remember when we were first managed to get in contact with one of the family members. Luckily it was a voice call, so they couldn't see, but my hands were trembling because there's a true difference between maybe talking to someone at work or talking to one of your friends. There's a true difference between that and having to confront someone who's been through something so terrible, like losing a family member. It takes a lot of maturity and it takes a lot of empathy to be able to talk to someone in that manner, especially in a more professional setting. So I think over the time of this whole class, as myself and Ryan have been talking with the families, we've been able to better build our capabilities of talking with others, especially in those settings where we want to be empathetic towards what these people have been through.
And I think most people who have not taken this class who are in forensics right now, who plan on taking this class their junior or senior year, think that this class is like some cool opportunity to like investigate like a cool case that actually happened. Well, it is a cool program, but eventually you've got to learn that these are real people, these are real lives, and you're talking to real people who have lost something. So you have to keep that in mind that this class is it's not about you. It's about the case, and you're representing the family members and the victims of this case.
That was really good. I was gonna say,
was-
wow, you
yeah.
hit exactly what this class is supposed to be on the head, and I'm glad you've learned those lessons.
How did you guys become emotionally attached to this case?
Well, obviously, as part of a school process, this class is a grade to it, but that grade does eventually, it kind of weaned off. I stopped, pulling up my computer and checking every week. And at a certain point, the goal of this was not to get a good grade. The goal of this was to make the family proud. I wanted them to know that their voices were heard, and I wanted them to know that there still are people out there trying to at least get some sort of justice for these victims. So I think it's finding that drive behind, especially when we met the family, finding that drive behind hoping that something can become of this. Hopefully that this will push forward some new information, hopefully get someone to release something to further this investigation.
Yeah, initially when we picked this case, it stood out to us because then, there was 3 victims involved. There were a 61-year-old grandmother, a 20-year-old grandson, and an unrelated, a family friend, I suppose, a 7-month-old baby. And obviously, learning that there was a 7-month-old baby who was a victim of this heinous act caused us to, be attached at first. Now, as we learned more about who Deanna and Charles were as people, they were very kind and they didn't deserve something like this to happen to them. So we got attached to them after we had our conversations with Rebecca and Lucas Henderson, and just learning more about who they were as people and how admirable their behaviors were.
And I'm sure the family is extremely appreciative of not only the presentation you guys done, but your continued follow-up and looking into of this case, because sometimes these cases just get forgotten in the bottom of police basements. So the fact that it's super important that you're bringing this case back to light, putting their names back out there, because all it takes is one person to say something that could potentially lead to a closed case.
And one of the things I wish I could have done during your guys' work was to videotape and record all the things that you did, because you guys were one of those groups that I saw daily trying to find something else. You didn't just settle on the fact that those articles were only things out there. And I appreciate that. And I appreciate the fact that you put that much effort into it. And I think that Deanna Perry's family really appreciated it as well. And I want to just say thank you for that. We appreciate all that you've done for the case. And we hope that someday Deanna Perry, Charles Climer, and Brianna Smith will get justice, and the family will move on somewhat, knowing that the person that did it is caught. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cold Case MHS.
This podcast was edited by the students of Cold Case MHS and produced by Mr. Hubbard and myself. The music was performed and written by Alexa Dahl, and the artwork was created by the students of MHS Design Studio Internship.
Please consider sharing this podcast to bring more light to these victims. Tune in next time to Cold Case MHS, Monsters and Demons.
Photographs faded, memories grown old. A story entangled, a crime so unfaithful, yet left untold. A puzzle in the dark, we will find that spark. There you've left their mark. Victims in memory, let's find the enemy. We won't leave it be. Behind every shadow, a story to be told. Of lives that were special, but some hearts have grown cold. In the depths of the darkness, a flicker of hope remains. Behind every cold case, there's people fighting